There's a record in men's tennis that nobody has ever wanted to hold. And yet, for over 2 decades now, one man has owned it entirely alone. Marcelo Ríos is the only player in the Open era to reach world number 1 without ever winning a single Grand Slam title. That fact alone has followed him for 25 years, usually attached to some version of the same dismissive label. The worst world number 1 in tennis history. A ranking fluke. A cautionary tale about what the computer can say versus what actually matters in this sport. But spend any real time with Rios' actual career, and a very different picture starts to emerge. Ask the players who shared a court with him at his absolute peak, and you'll hear something that sounds nothing like worst. You'll hear words like unteachable, off the charts. Some of the greatest hands the sport has ever produced. So which version is true? Was Marcelo Ríos really the least deserving world number 1 the game has ever seen? Or is he something far more interesting, one of the most talented players in tennis history, remembered for the wrong reasons entirely? To understand what Marcelo Ríos actually was as a player, you have to go back to Santiago, Chile, in the early 1990s, a country with almost no history of producing elite tennis talent, and a young boy already showing the kind of hands coaches don't see more than once or twice in a generation. Rios turned professional in 1994, at just 18 years old. He announced himself almost immediately, pushing Pete Sampras to the brink in his very first year on tour at the French Open. Over the following seasons, he built a resume of scalps that read like a highlight reel of the sport's biggest names. Wins over Jim Courier, Boris Becker, Gustavo Kuerten, Andre Agassi, Mark Philippoussi. Legends, all of them. Players who, unlike Rios himself, had Grand Slam titles sitting on their own resumes. By 1998, the talent had translated into genuine dominance. Rios claimed the Miami Open, beating Agassi in the final, and with that win, became the first South American man in history to reach the world number 1 ranking. It was a genuinely historic achievement, a 22-year-old from Santiago, standing at the very top of a sport that had never before produced a champion from his part of the world. That same season brought him agonizingly close to the achievement that would have silenced every critic for good. Rios reached the final of the Australian Open, his first and ultimately only Grand Slam final. Standing across the net was Petr Korda, a talented but unheralded Czech player who beat Rios in 4 sets to claim the title. It was a genuine heartbreak for the young Chilean, and one that later took on a very different shade entirely. Korda tested positive for a banned steroid later that same season, a revelation that cast a long shadow backward over that Melbourne final, and left Rios with a legitimate grievance that's followed him for decades. He held the number 1 ranking for a total of 6 weeks across 2 separate stretches in 1998, closing out the year by winning 2 more Masters events and the season-ending Grand Slam Cup. By any reasonable measure, it was one of the finest seasons any player produced that year. Full stop, Grand Slam title or not. But the following seasons told a very different story. Persistent injuries began chipping away at his career almost immediately, forcing him to miss majors, disrupting the rhythm that had made him so dangerous. He showed flashes of his old brilliance here and there, a run to the Australian Open semi-final in 2002, but the sustained health that a career at the very top requires simply never returned. By 2004, at just 28 years old, after a full year without competing, Marcelo Ríos officially retired. A career that peaked earlier and faded faster than almost anyone in the sport's history at that level, cut short not by declining talent, but by a body that simply couldn't hold up. So if the injuries explain the shortened career, what explains the worst number 1 label that's followed Rios for over 2 decades? For that, you have to look past the tennis entirely, into something far messier. The persona he built, deliberately or not, throughout his time at the top. Rios never played the role tennis expected of its champions. He rarely engaged warmly with the media, often declining interviews outright, unbothered by how that silence might be perceived. When he finally reached the summit of the sport, winning the Monte Carlo Masters at just 21, he took the microphone at the trophy ceremony and gave a speech so brief, so unceremonious, that it instantly cemented his reputation as tennis's reluctant, uninterested superstar. It wasn't rudeness exactly. It was simply Rios refusing to perform a version of gratitude and humility that didn't reflect how he actually felt in the moment. That pattern repeated itself on an even bigger stage. When he became world number one, the president of Chile personally invited him to the presidential palace and asked if he had any message for the Chilean people. Rios's entire response was a single word: no. For a country celebrating its first ever world number one in any sport, that response landed like a slap, and it followed him for the rest of his career, shaping how an entire nation, and eventually the entire sport, chose to remember him. There were darker moments too, an altercation involving a taxi driver and police officers following a loss in Rome, an incident where he accidentally struck his own physical trainer with his car, later described as unintentional, though it ended their working relationship shortly after. None of these moments defined him as a person entirely, but stacked together, they built a public image that had almost nothing to do with his tennis, and everything to do with a young man who simply refused to manage his own narrative the way the sport expected its biggest stars to. Sports Illustrated once went so far as to call him the most hated man in tennis, and Rios, characteristically, didn't seem to care in the slightest. "What other people think about me, or say of me, simply does not interest me," he said at the height of his number one run. "I just go my own way." That refusal to conform is precisely where the worst number one narrative actually comes from. Not from his level of play, which by every account from the players who faced him was genuinely elite. It comes from a public that struggled to separate a player's talent from his personality, and a media environment that punished him for declining to play along. Strip away the persona entirely, and go back to the actual tennis, and the argument for Rios as one of the most genuinely gifted players in the sport's history becomes remarkably strong. Strong enough that respected voices in the sport have made it explicitly, decades after his retirement. Greg Rusedski, a former top 5 player himself who faced Rios at his absolute peak, has called him flatly the greatest player in the history of tennis never to win a Grand Slam, ranking him above even modern greats with far longer resumes, arguing that reaching world number one outweighs almost any other individual achievement in the sport. Rusedski's description of what actually made Rios so dangerous is telling. Hands he called simply off the charts, a level of creativity and defensive craft that let him lob, retrieve, and construct points in ways very few players of his era, or any era, could genuinely replicate. That testimony matters because it comes from someone who actually had to stand across the net from Rios during his prime, not someone judging his legacy purely by a trophy count decades later. And it reframes the entire worst number one conversation in a completely different light. This wasn't a player who backed into the top ranking through a weak field or a fluke season. This was a player good enough, on his best days, to beat nearly every legend of his generation: Sampras, Agassi, Becker, Courier, Kuerten, simply unable to convert that talent into the one specific achievement the sport uses to measure true greatness. The injuries that cut his career short at 28 only reinforce that argument. A player who peaks that dramatically, that early, and then loses years of his prime to a body that simply couldn't hold up, isn't necessarily a player whose ceiling was ever in question. It's a player whose ceiling the world never got to see fully realized. Rios himself, reflecting on his career decades later, made clear that the absence of a Grand Slam title genuinely doesn't define how he sees his own legacy. A level of peace that suggests he understood, even if the wider tennis world didn't, exactly what he'd actually accomplished during his brief run at the top. So was Marcelo Ríos really the worst world number one in tennis history? By one narrow measure, the label technically fits. He remains the only man in the Open era to ever reach the top ranking without a Grand Slam title attached to his name. That fact is permanent, unchangeable, and it will likely follow his name for as long as the sport keeps records. But greatness in tennis has never been measured by a single statistic alone, and everyone who actually shared a court with Rios at his peak seems to understand that far better than the history books do. This was a player good enough to beat nearly every legend of his generation, gifted enough that a former top 5 pro would later call him the finest player in the sport's history to never lift a major trophy, talented enough to become the first South American man to ever reach the summit of the game. What actually cost him a Grand Slam wasn't a lack of ability. It was a heartbreaking final loss to an opponent, later revealed to have failed a drug test, followed by a body that broke down years before it should have, ending a career of extraordinary promise at just 28 years old. Layer on top of that a personality that refused to perform likability for a sport that demanded it, and you get exactly the reputation that's followed him for over 2 decades. Not a fair reflection of his tennis, but a public's inability to separate genuine, once-in-a-generation talent from a man who simply wouldn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. Maybe the real story of Marcelo Rios isn't about being tennis's worst world number one at all. Maybe it's about being one of the most talented players the sport has ever produced, remembered for all the wrong reasons, by a world that never quite figured out how to appreciate a champion who refused to ask for its approval. Sometimes the record books tell only half the story. If this changed how you see Marcelo Rios, hit subscribe. We tell the stories other channels skip.